Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are starting our series on governments. Today we're going to be talking about a variety of different ones, including Anarchy. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, John and I are talking about Anarchy as well as a number of different governments that we'll be making extensive videos on in the future. John, starting to talk about government is a very complex subject. There is so many to be taken in account for. But why don't you start us off, I guess, with the definition of government and why this is important in the context of TTRPGs.
Well, I mean, in terms of definition of government, I feel like we kind of all have this working knowledge of what a government is, what it does, what the purpose is for, and generally speaking, it's something that's just taking, originally it's taking established forays or mores and norms and putting them into something that's codified so that there is established rule for the way things are supposed to operate. What is right, what is wrong, and potentially what the punishments are for engaging in behaviors that are not acceptable. Throughout this series, we're going to be talking about a variety of types of government. We've basically broken these down into 4 major categories, and then each video will dive into the types of governments that fall into those categories. Today we'll be focusing on Anarchy. But I want to point out that as we're going through and we're talking about these, even though we're gonna talk about a democracy, or we're going to be talking about a representative democracy or something like that, there's no reason you can't combine these. And we see this in our own world, where you have things like a totalitarian style leader that oversees a democracy, but the democracy doesn't really work completely, and there might be some checks on the power of that totalitarian style ruler. And so you end up with this mishmash of governments, and I think it's important to kind of take all of these things that we're talking about throughout these videos and realizing that you can combine them and create something unique with them if you so choose.
And to be fair, those of us that are being the GM in a game probably don't all have a degree in political theory. Right. So we're probably not going to get all the check boxes marked right in trying to present this to our players or to the characters within the game. So I think it's okay to give yourself some permission to have a little freedom and explore it in a way that's going to bring your game to life.
Exactly. So we're going to talk initially about the different categories. We're going to end on Anarchy because we're going to have more of a conversation about Anarchy during this video. Our future videos will address autocracies, democracies, and oligarchies. So autocracies, what we're using for our definition, is ruled by one. So these are governments in which one person is in control, and that person may be in control for a variety of different reasons, but it's anything from a monarchy that you would associate with most fantasy settings, all the way through a totalitarian-style dictatorship that you might associate with modern times and the amount of power and control that they have on the world. And that is going to be the next video in our line after this one.
So democracy is when a government is in the hands of the people. And we talk about this a lot in our modern world. The precise amount of power that is in the hands of those individuals can vary widely. Anywhere from a direct democracy to a representative democracy to a totalitarian democracy. So we'll be talking about those in a video in this series as well.
And then the last video in the series will be discussing oligarchies. Oligarchies are one of my personal favorites when it comes to government styles. I find them very interesting because the way that people choose to delineate power based off of generally arbitrary qualities, anything from age, where you have gerontocracies, all the way through patriarchies and matriarchies, where it's based off of your sex. It's very interesting to me the way that oligarchies come together, but that will be the final video in the series where we do a deep dive into a variety of types of oligarchies. The only other thing that I want to mention here is that as we're going through and we're doing these various types of governments and we're breaking them into these categories, we're going to hit on some major ones, but there are definitely a ton of different types of autocracies, democracies, oligarchies that we're not going to touch on because there is literally like an endless supply of these things. If you want to do more research to come up with other varieties of these or come up with ones that are specific to the setting that you're interested in, by all means get into that.
It's interesting to me that we'll be ending on oligarchies, which is your favorite, but we get to start with anarchies, which are my personal favorite.
Right.
Those that are not familiar with anarchies, I know they have a lot of negative connotation in today's world. They're typically perceived as being environment of chaos or societal collapse in some way. But that's not really the way that anarchists usually look at anarchy. They typically look at it as being a society without hierarchy overall. One of the founders, named Pierre Joseph Proudhon, had said that it's not the daughter but the mother of all order, because order comes from the people themselves and not from a government or an overarching institution that's kind of governing them. It was actually founded by 3 different individuals: William Godwin, Pierre Proudhon, and then Max Stirner. But it's a fascinating government where they see it. I remember this in political theory in college, where they see anarchy as being the most advanced type of government that could exist because it doesn't need a governing body over a community.
And that's the thing that I find most interesting about anarchies. And by no means is our anarchy something that I am particularly well voiced in, but I always think of anarchies as being either the best or the absolute worst when it comes to government, because it really kind of depends. Is the society that you're talking about, have they evolved well enough? Have they developed well enough to where they've gotten to this stage of government is no longer necessary, so we don't have it? Or is it a situation where the government has completely collapsed and there's nobody in control and it's just chaos, which is what we traditionally think of as anarchy? And I think that you kind of end up on either end of that spectrum. I don't know if there's much in the middle there.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and I think that's true. Your utilization of have we developed to this point is interesting to me, because I think, and I hope we get some extreme anarchists here to kind of give some some voice to this in the comments and talk about it. But from the perception of those that would claim to be anarchists in the modern world, they would say that our structure doesn't allow us to develop to a place of understanding anarchist principles. When you are raised in an environment where there are governments and laws and police and other authority members that structure the progression of human thought and understanding systems, you are incapable of imagining a world where those don't exist. And that's why you see the worst end of things when anarchy occurs, because people don't know how to handle their own personal power or personal authority in those situations to have a functioning society. And that's why we see that explosion. Now, if we raise people differently to understand it differently, that's where that positive representation of like social anarchy or mutualism then exists, where people are able to self-govern.
Well, there's also a conversation that can be had around human nature, right? Mm-hmm. So if there's anarchies by rote have an absence of power, there's a vacuum that exists there. And generally speaking, depending on what philosophy that you subscribe to, you may believe that if there is a vacuum of power, someone will seize that. They will attempt to take it. And so it may not even necessarily be that the majority of the population could not live in a society in which there are no walls, there are no structures. It's that if there's nobody who enforces the status quo, someone will take advantage of that and seize the power in order to be in control. And that is also an interesting way of looking at it. So, I'm talking about human nature, but we're also talking about fantasy settings. I mean, you can apply this to almost anything if you're doing a sci-fi setting or something else. But if you're thinking about other societies or other species of creatures, what are their natures? Do they have a nature which relies or requires them to seize power, or you have that kind of innate desire to become the alpha in a government or in a society? Is that going to happen in this type of scenario? Can an anarchy exist without somebody taking control of it?
And that's the exciting piece that comes along when you're building a fantasy world for your players to explore, is how you understand the nature of those races within that environment? Are you kind of falling into this like John Locke blank slate type of thing where people don't have an innate human nature and it's just whatever the world provides to them shapes them? Is it more of like this original sin mentality of where people are always vying for power and they're drawn towards evil and they want to engage in things that are going to lift them up while pushing other people down? Or is it that we are all naturally good and that we're all wanting the best for others and we uphold moral ideals or virtues in some way, shape, or form? Now, for the anarchist government, that the latter would be where they perceive it. They kind of uphold this idea or this importance, these moral claims that all people are driven by concepts like individual liberty, freedom from domination, ideals of equality and community and non-coercive consensus building among one another. And so they think that all those are like seeds within the human experience, or of course, because we live in a human world, that drive them towards accomplishing those things in some way. But if your fantasy world doesn't allow for that type of inerrant good to exist within each individual, then anarchy may not fit within the world that you're building.
Right. And that's where I really, because this, that this is something that I've been working on in terms of like my own rule set that I've been using for RPGs and developing, that one of the things that I've developed is also unique traits that exist for various species of creatures where, orcs have specific tendencies and traits and gnomes and elves and that type of thing. But that's what I think about is elves don't tend to have this need to have power over others or over other people in their society or over other people in the world. And this is kind of going back to like the Tolkien style elves. We're not talking about Silmarillion where they were going around murdering dwarves. We're talking about like the idealized version of this. Not getting too far afield. But the point is that they have in their nature the ability to potentially have an anarchical society that does not require them to rule over one another, rule over other people, and ultimately live in a society that has this almost utopian feel to it because government doesn't exist and they don't need it. Finding that in a place, I think, in your world would be very interesting to come across, particularly for an NPC event or a PC adventuring party where they're going through, and it's like you go through these, tribal societies where it's just basically a despotic style government, and there's one person who's in control, and it's the mightiest, strongest, most physically domineering individual. And then you come across this other society where it's like, all right, I need to go talk to your leader, and they're like, well, I don't know what you mean by that. There's nobody in charge here. Like, we don't do that. It's like, that's not necessary because we're never in a scenario where one person has to have command or control over any other individual in our society. And I think for many players, that will be a bit of a mind-blowing scenario that they just have not seen or come across before.
Yeah. I agree. It's even hard to conceptualize it and talk about it because truly in the known world, we don't have any real true anarchist communities or societies where that exists, where people are making decisions for both their individual freedoms, but also their collective freedoms to be able to function together as a society. And so there are some things you have to consider when you're building a place like this within your world. Like, how do they handle crime within that society? How do they handle the distribution of food or goods or services? And there are different anarchist theories that kind of fit around this. There's individualist anarchist theories. There's communal or collective anarchist theories on how they handle it. There's anarcho communist like theories on like whether or not you're basing things on the amount of energy that's utilized or how much the need is there for somebody, or if you're just trying to have equal shares distributed out maybe. So there are different ways of looking at functioning in that society. I thought we could talk about crime a little bit as an example on how you would maybe handle crime in an anarchist society. This means, again, you don't have any governing bodies. There's no laws. There's no police. There's no magistrate that's executing something. So in an anarchist society, you usually have what's considered like a communal decision-making process. It's not a republic, so you don't have like everyone like deciding. It's not a democracy where, you know, people are voting necessarily. It's more of like this understanding of like a decision needs to be made, and there's been a wrong, and we're going to make a decision based on the information that we pull in to make sure that we're upholding the values of people's individual liberties and things like that. So in an anarchist society, when you're looking at crime, imprisonment is typically rejected.
Right.
There's no jails. There's nobody to oversee that. I'm not going to force you, John, to go and guard somebody and take away your personal authority and liberties, to take away your time to watch somebody else for a crime that they did. That's inflicting on your liberty, so to speak. So instead of punishment, they do things like public denunciations to the wrongdoer. Maybe there's ostracism that takes place. There might be financial restitution if they took money. They may be banished from the society altogether. In extreme cases, they may utilize the death penalty, but that's usually not one that they're fond of.
So that's very interesting to me, the way that would come together, because I think for viewers it would be the same way, where you get to a certain point and go, well, it's no longer, if they have a norm for the way that an offense is handled, it almost feels like it's no longer an anarchy. So right. if you go at the moment that the society says, okay, the rule is that if you do something bad, you get I want to say excommunicated. you get kicked
banished.
Out. You get banished.
Yeah.
So at the moment that you go wrongdoing, banishment, you then have a law, right? So that law, by definition, means that it is no longer an anarchy. And if you have people who are kicking someone out, how do you enforce that? Because what's to keep them from just coming back or refusing to leave or anything along those lines? Because then you have a situation where, well, somebody has to enforce that. And I think the thing is that we are also trying to apply our own human style of this is when something goes bad. And I think idealized in an anarchical society, it doesn't happen. Like, it's not a concern. You don't have somebody who steals something. You don't have somebody who does something like that because, using the elven example again, it's not part of their nature that they would ever steal anything or do any wrong. And I think that your examples there provide a lot of reasoning why we as humans cannot support an idealized anarchical society, because at the moment we start going, here are the rules, this is what we do when this happens, this is what it's like, okay, you've got a government then. You've got something that happens as a consequence to something else. You have rules for what is right and what is wrong when it comes to things like crime or murder or whatever. And then you have consequences for those crimes, and you have somebody who has to enforce it. And all of those things together create a government at a certain point. Yeah.
Now, I would agree with that, and I don't know if anarchies really ever existed successfully in any way in human history. I used to be much well-versed on this back in my days of being in college and studying some political theory stuff.
Right.
And I used to have stacks of anarchist books because I found them fascinating. But I sometimes think about those earliest civilizations when, the first man was murdered in a community, or the first person was stolen from, or when the ideas of private property were conceptualized. I don't know if anybody's ever read, the Communist Manifesto and looking at private property and that type of thing. But when you start having these new ideas about this is mine and that is yours and we don't share and you're infringing on my liberty, it's such an interesting thing to think about how laws were suddenly structured around that and how we categorized it and utilized it to make government in what we now see in the modern world. And so how do you go back before all that existed to create something that's realistic in your fantasy world to really kind of give a taste of what anarchy may look like in terms of this idealized version of it?
Well, and I think that's where you get into those despotic style governments, because it is the biggest, strongest one. It is the alpha in the pack, is the one who determines these things. So everything in the tribe or everything in the society is the alphas, and he allows you to have things, or she allows you to have things until they want them. It's the same thing that I see if, I've got two dogs, one of them has a toy, the other one wants it. If the other one is bigger, he'll take it. And that is the basis, I think that is the basis of government to a certain degree, is at a certain point, there is one who is physically powerful enough to take what they want, and then they're the ones who are in charge because nobody else can challenge that individual. And that is... From there, you grow upwards. You move in a direction. But ultimately, there is an individual who is in charge, or there is a group who are in charge, who have the physical power to enforce law or enforce their will upon others.
Now you guys just need to kick back, grab a drink, because for the next 2 hours, John and I are going to be diving into some philosophical discussion about might is right.
Yeah.
Which
is not right. It's just that's kind of the natural order of things. The physically domineering individual is the one who has control. That is the basis of government. And then what you're talking about when it comes to crimes and other things is suddenly the alpha who is in charge, and they have communication, and you have two other individuals who are arguing or debating, or they have some kind of disagreement, bring their disagreement to the alpha, and the alpha is suddenly the one who has to make a decision about what is right and what is wrong in that scenario. You start to create just this cyclical system of, okay, this is the way that I ruled it last time, I'm going to rule it the same way this time.
Yeah. And this is the challenge. This is the real challenge that you're going to find as a GM, as you're starting to construct these different types of governments for your world, is that we not only have, I don't want to call it the truths, but we have this conceptualization of how things function and how things are structured, and all of us have been raised in a society that's had a particular form of government that we're very familiar with. And so even with Anarchy and creating this within your gameplay, you have to kind of like pick yourself up and remove yourself from those rules of, characteristics within humans, attributes based on gender, or psychology, philosophies that we carry with us about, the structure of the world and how things have progressed in human history. So you can really create something novel within your world that, again, holds up the ideals of whatever government you're trying to implore. In this case with Anarchy, you almost have to forget some of what you know about the natural world in order to create an environment that's realistic for your players that kind of represent those ideals that this government would have within its creation.
Yeah, and I almost feel like in this scenario you have to come at an anarchy in a couple of ways. One is that it is, like we've talked about, it's chaos. That it is just, the government has failed and anarchy exists. Option two is that anarchy exists, but it is very fragile. Some of the stuff that Joshua was talking about, where the PCs come in and this anarchy is in this constant state of flux because they're trying to maintain this, but things like crime occur and they don't know how to handle it without somehow creating a government at the same time. And so there's this idealized notion of this is anarchy and this is what we're after, but they also can't get rid of it. Or you're in a scenario where you have a type or a species or a type of people who do not have the same natural tendencies to commit crimes, whether that's murder or theft, or simply try and seize power given the opportunity, because that is really the only scenario in which an actual anarchy could exist for any period of time.
Yeah. The only example that I can really think of off the top of my head, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I might be misremembering, but I think of the Tinkers in the Wheel of Fortune series, the band of travelers that are moving along, that are kind of the carefree people that have this communal society where they're sharing things and exchanging things, and there's not, I don't remember a state of government or policing or laws or rules within their community specifically, and I know that crime in of itself was something that they knew existed in the outside world but was not within their own community. To come in and murder there or steal there was unheard of. It was like, what? Well, why would you do that?
There's a few things there. One, they had leaders. I don't remember the name of the leaders. I think it was like the speaker, maybe, or something like that. They were the one who decided where the caravan went and what they did. If somebody committed a crime, I don't know if theft necessarily had the same implications, but violence was not allowed. if a member of the Tinker
which I
tribe,
think was banishment.
It was banishment. They basically pretended like that person was dead to them. And
Mm-hmm.
no spoilers here. But there was an individual who did pick up a weapon at one point that is only intended to do violence, and his own family basically just turned their back on him and said, we're not going to be, like, we don't know you. You're dead to us, basically. So they did have rules. They did have somebody who was in control. There was a set of rules around, like, no, don't murder, don't pick up weapons, violence, that type of stuff. So they did have that. It was more of a peaceful style society, rather than, I would say, an anarchy necessarily. But I would say that it probably is about as close as you're going to see in a lot of in a lot of what we would consider most fiction that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there's other books that probably deal with it better, but it's a very good example of what an anarchy, a realistic anarchy, for instance,
is trying to achieve
or look like.
Well, that's probably the extent of my knowledge on anarchy specifically, and I really appreciate here at the end how you've determined that if you're going to put it into your world, you can go for this idealistic type of anarchy, whether it's collective or social, but you may also just be utilizing it as the failure of government and kind of this means of chaos because people don't know how to handle what has just happened with the crumbling or the collapse of the government that they were functioning underneath.
And this video definitely turned into a lot of political theory, which I hope everybody found interesting, and a lot of philosophizing by the two of us. The future videos, I think, are going to be more examples of these types of governments that you could plug and play and put in your own campaign, that you can then use more readily, because these are types of governments that have existed or do exist currently, which will make a lot more sense for you to actually apply. Anarchy is definitely this theoretical, ephemeral type of government that, like Joshua mentioned, is not something that exists in our world really in its idealized state. It's really just that chaotic form that even then exists for very brief periods of time as one government collapses and another government takes control.
All right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. Be sure to click that bell and hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.
Jon and Josh.